His name was Karl Ernst. At the height of his power, this one man commanded over 500,000 armed soldiers in the streets of Berlin, more men under his direct control than most generals in Europe. He didn't need a court, a judge, or a trial. If Karl Ernst decided you were an enemy, you were beaten in broad daylight and nobody dared stop it. He organized riots that tore through Jewish neighborhoods while families were walking home from prayer. He turned rival political offices into torture rooms. He is even suspected, by serious historians, of secretly setting the fire that destroyed German democracy overnight. For years, Karl Ernst was one of the most feared men on the planet, untouchable, invincible, a man who believed he was above every law, every enemy, every consequence. And then, in a matter of hours, he was dragged in chains, beaten until his own men couldn't recognize his face, and shot dead by the very regime he'd spent his life terrorizing people for. This is how it happened. Before we go further, this channel exists to tell the stories that other history channels are too scared to touch. If that's what you're here for, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because what happens next to Karl Ernst is one of the most brutal betrayals in Nazi history. Let's get into it. To understand how a man like Karl Ernst was even possible, you have to understand the Germany that built him. After World War I, Germany wasn't just defeated, it was gutted. The empire collapsed in 1918. The economy cratered into total ruin. Millions of soldiers came home from the trenches to a country with no jobs, no pride, and no answers for them. What it did have was rage. Somebody had to be blamed. Somebody had to pay for the humiliation. Into that vacuum poured armed paramilitary gangs. Hundreds of thousands of angry, desperate men roaming the streets, brawling in beer halls, settling political scores with fists, knives, and pistols. Each group was convinced they alone could save Germany from collapse. One of those gangs would go on to become the most feared paramilitary force in modern history, the Sturmabteilung, the SA, the Brown Shirts, and Karl Ernst would rise inside it faster than almost anyone. Ernst was born in Berlin in 1904. His father worked as a bodyguard for one of Germany's wealthiest industrialists, a man who would later help bankroll the entire Nazi war machine. Karl's own early life gave no hint of what he'd become. He drifted between odd jobs: hotel bellhop, office clerk, and for a while, a bouncer at a nightclub in Berlin's underground scene, learning early how to control a room through pure physical force. Then, in 1923, at just 19 years old, he joined the SA, and he found exactly what he'd been searching for his entire life. A place where violence wasn't a crime, it was a career. The SA's mission was brutally simple: protect the party, terrorize its enemies, and use raw fear as a political weapon. That same year, the movement made its first violent grab for power, the failed beer hall putsch, when Hitler tried to seize the German government by force. Police opened fire in the street. 16 Nazis died. Hitler was arrested and sentenced to 5 years for treason. He served 8 months. When Hitler walked free in 1925, he rebuilt the SA from nothing, and this time it grew like a disease. 6,000 stormtroopers marched at the party rally in 1926. By 1930, the number hit 60,000. Then the Great Depression tore through Germany, and millions of humiliated, unemployed men flooded straight into the ranks. By 1932, the SA had swelled past 400,000 members. 2 years later, it topped 3 million men, bigger than the entire German army combined. And this wasn't a political club with uniforms. It was a machine built purely for violence. Stormtroopers stormed rival rallies and beat opponents bloody in full daylight, in front of witnesses without fear of arrest. They hunted down Jewish families, Roma communities, communists, socialists, anyone who stood between the party and total control. In one raid in early 1933, Brownshirts smashed their way into a rival political office, beat a man to death on the spot, and turned the building into a private torture site for weeks afterward. This was the world Karl Ernst was clawing his way through, and he climbed it faster than almost anyone in the organization. By the end of 1931, he was a top adjutant inside the SA's Berlin leadership, holding serious rank. Within a year, he commanded an entire SA division across East Berlin, giving direct orders to thousands of armed men. But his rise came at a price. He made enemies just as fast as he made rank. The SA's supreme commander, Ernst Röhm, was known within the party to be gay, an open secret his enemies weaponized constantly to attack him and anyone close to him. When a new Berlin SA chief promoted Karl Ernst alongside another officer suspected of the same, the backlash inside the organization turned vicious almost overnight. Rivals mocked the group as a secretive inner circle running the SA from the shadows. Ernst became a personal target of the rumors, tied publicly to a well-connected civilian ally who had helped fuel his rise through the ranks. The whispers turned violent fast. In one incident, a party member confronted Ernst directly inside a Berlin pub, screaming accusations in front of a room full of witnesses, calling him a disgrace to the movement. Ernst denied everything on the spot. The rumors never stopped following him, but nobody who actually knew him ever doubted what he was capable of in the streets. In September 1931, Karl Ernst helped orchestrate one of the ugliest anti-Jewish riots Berlin had ever witnessed. As Jewish families were walking home from synagogue after a Holy Day service on one of the city's busiest avenues, roughly 1,000 SA men descended on the street at once. Families were attacked in the open. Bystanders were beaten indiscriminately, whether they were involved or not. Witnesses later described the mob chanting for Jewish blood as the violence rolled block after block through the city, completely unchecked by police. This was Karl Ernst operating in exactly the role the SA had trained him for. Not a soldier, not a politician, but an engine of pure terror pointed at anyone the party wanted destroyed. His cruelty wasn't limited to the streets either. Ernst moved comfortably through Berlin's darker social underworld, reportedly a regular guest at private parties hosted by a wealthy Jewish businessman who personally loaned money to Ernst and several other rising Nazi officials. It didn't stop Ernst from turning on him. That same benefactor was murdered years later by the very regime he had helped finance. A regime built in part by men like Karl Ernst who took his money and gave nothing back but betrayal. On the night of February 27, 1933, just weeks after Hitler became chancellor, the German parliament building erupted in flames. The Nazis moved on it instantly, almost too fast to be a coincidence. Within hours, they convinced the aging President Hindenburg that communists were staging an armed uprising and pushed through an emergency decree that wiped out free speech, a free press, and the right to peaceful assembly in a single stroke. It became the legal backbone of the entire Nazi dictatorship, the document that let Hitler arrest, jail, and silence anyone he wanted. A young Dutch communist was arrested at the scene, put on a rush trial, and executed for starting the blaze. Most historians accept that he acted alone, but a unproven theory has circled for decades. That Karl Ernst himself led a small SA team through a hidden underground tunnel connecting a nearby government building directly into the parliament, and personally lit the fire so it could be pinned on a helpless scapegoat. It's never been proven. It may never be. But if there was one man in Germany with the access, the ruthlessness, and the motive to pull off something that dark and get away with it clean, every account of his life points straight to Karl Ernst. By 1934, the SA wasn't just large. It was armed, radical, and completely out of Hitler's direct control, and that made it a five-alarm problem. SA Commander Ernst Röhm had a vision that terrified Germany's old guard: fold the entire German army into the SA and launch what he called a second revolution, tearing down the traditional power structures and replacing them with radical loyalists like Karl Ernst. 3 million armed men stood ready behind that idea. Hitler didn't share it. He needed the generals, the industrialists, and the conservative establishment on his side, not a 3-million-man militia threatening to swallow the military whole. Behind closed doors, the SS and its intelligence chief quietly began building a case to destroy Röhm and every officer loyal to him. They fabricated a story from nothing, that Röhm had taken a massive bribe from a foreign government to overthrow Hitler personally. It was a lie from top to bottom. By every serious historical account, Röhm never plotted against his Führer. He was loyal until his final breath. It didn't matter. The decision had already been made. On June 28, 1934, Hitler summoned the SA's top commanders to a resort outside Munich under a false pretense. 2 days later, SS units surrounded them at dawn while most were still asleep. They were arrested on the spot, hauled to a Munich prison, and executed one after another without trial. Röhm himself was handed a pistol and given the honor of ending his own life quietly. He refused. An S commander walked directly into his cell and shot him personally, on Hitler's explicit order. The night of the long knives had begun, and Karl Ernst had no idea his own name was already on the list. Karl Ernst knew absolutely nothing about any of it. On the morning of June 30, 1934, he arrived at the docks in Bremerhaven with his new bride, dressed sharp, ready to board a ship for their honeymoon in Madeira. He was relaxed, laughing, completely convinced he was untouchable. He had no idea that back in Berlin, his name had already been written into a kill order. An arrest command reached the dock before the ship could leave port. Ernst was seized right in front of his wife, torn away from her mid-embrace, and beaten savagely on the spot by the SS officers sent to take him. The same brutal tactics he himself had used on countless strangers for over a decade, now turned back on him with full force. He was handed over to a commando unit led by one of Hitler's own personal bodyguards, interrogated under torture, and loaded onto a military plane bound straight for Berlin. By late morning, he was standing in an SS barracks courtyard, facing a firing squad pulled from Hitler's own elite personal guard, the most loyal soldiers in the entire Reich. Witnesses claimed Ernst raised his arm in a Nazi salute as the shots rang out, still insisting this was a horrible misunderstanding, still insisting that Hitler, the man he had beaten, terrorized, and killed for without hesitation, would step in and fix everything at the last possible second. Nobody stepped in. He was 29 years old. His wife was arrested and held for 2 weeks before being quietly released without charge. She lived out the rest of her life in Berlin, dying decades later, long after the German parliament had retroactively declared the entire massacre completely legal. 2 weeks after the killings, Hitler stood in front of that same parliament and publicly branded Karl Ernst and every other victim as traitors and paid foreign agents. Not a single person in the room challenged him. Nobody dared say a word. A month later, President Hindenburg died. Within hours, Hitler abolished the presidency entirely and merged it into his own office, seizing absolute, unchecked power over the entire country. The men who had physically built his rise to power, the street fighters, the enforcers, the ones who did every piece of dirty work Hitler never wanted his own hands on, had become dangerous liabilities the moment he no longer needed them. So he had them shot, one after another, and stepped over their bodies on his way to total control of Germany. Karl Ernst went from a nightclub bouncer with nothing to his name to one of the most feared men in all of Nazi Germany. He commanded hundreds of thousands of armed men. He organized riots that tore through entire communities. He may have helped light the very fire that burned German democracy to the ground in a single night. And in the end, the machine of terror he built with his own hands turned around and devoured him without a second of hesitation. That's the story of Karl Ernst, a man who thought he was untouchable, buried under the shadow of the monster he helped create. If this one hit different, smash that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who care about the history nobody else is telling. Subscribe to the War Files if you haven't already, and turn on that bell so you never miss the next one. We go where the textbooks stop. Drop a comment below. Do you think Karl Ernst really helped start the Reichstag fire? Let's hear it. We'll see you in the next one.